the White Scars. There is a way of fighting that the Imperium of man has never quite known what to do with. It is not the grinding attrition of a siege, not the disciplined advance of a battle line, not the precision of a surgical strike against a specific target. It is something older and wilder than any of these. The raid, the ambush, the cavalry charge that hits and vanishes before the enemy has finished registering what struck them. It is the warfare of the steppe, of the open plain, of a people who learned 10,000 years ago on a distant world that the army that controls its own speed controls the battle. The White Scars fight this way. They have always fought this way. And for 10,000 years, the Imperium of man has been grateful for it while never quite understanding it, which suits the sons of Jaghatai Khan perfectly well. Chogoris. The world known on imperial star charts as Mundus Planus, an overly literal High Gothic translation of the native name, is called Chogoris by its inhabitants and has been for as long as those inhabitants have kept records. It is a fertile world of vast green steppes, tall white mountains and blue seas, occupying a position in the segmentum Pacificus that left it isolated through the nightmare centuries of the Age of Strife. When the Great Crusade reached it, Chogoris had recovered from that long darkness to something approximating the technological level of a pre-gunpowder renaissance. Its dominant culture, organized as a feudal aristocracy under a ruler known as the Palatine, who controlled a sophisticated empire of cities and disciplined armies from a position of considerable comfort within those cities' walls. Outside the walls was the empty quarter. The empty quarter was almost everything. The vast, featureless steppes that stretched to every horizon and beyond, home to the nomadic tribes who had lived on the open plain for generations beyond counting, who measured wealth in horses and cattle and the respect of their fellow riders, and who had been fighting the Palatine's settled empire and each other for as long as anyone could remember. The settled people of the cities had technology, organization, and the luxury of walls. The tribes of the empty quarter had horses, mobility, and an understanding of open terrain that the city dwellers could not replicate. It was onto these steppes that the gestation capsule of a Primarch descended. The child was found by Khan, chieftain of a small tribe called the Talskars, who recognized that the infant climbing alone out of the impact site was no ordinary child and made the decision to raise him as his own. This was a decision that would eventually remake Chogoris entirely, though Khan did not live to see the full scope of it. He was killed by a rival tribe while Jaghatai was still young, and this killing galvanized the boy in ways that would define the warrior he became. He did not grieve passively. He gathered what warriors remained loyal to his adoptive father's memory, made war on those responsible, and won. The victory was the first entry in a catalogue that would grow very long, very quickly. Jaghatai Khan had the body of a Primarch, the physical capability that exceeded everything around him, and more importantly, he had the mind of one, the capacity for strategic thinking at a scale that the steppe's fractious tribal politics had never produced before. He began to unite the tribes, not through simple dominance, but through a combination of military force, rhetoric, and the genuine understanding that the tribe's fragmentation was what the Palatine's empire used against them. Unified, they could not be picked off one at a time. Unified, they could bring their natural advantages: speed, terrain knowledge, the ability to disperse and reconverge at will against an enemy that relied on the tactical assumptions of massed, organized infantry. The Palatine's armies were heavy. They relied on armored horsemen and disciplined infantry blocks, weapons and formation suited to holding ground and advancing methodically. Against a unified tribal confederation led by a Primarch who had intuitively understood the doctrine that speed is a weapon, they were systematically outmaneuvered. Jaghatai did not stand and fight the battles the Palatine's generals expected him to fight. He chose his ground, struck where the enemy was unprepared, and was gone before the response could be organized. The steppes ran red, as the old accounts put it. The cities fell. And within what would prove to be a startlingly brief period, all of Chogoris belonged to the tribes. Less than 6 months after Jaghatai Khan completed his conquest of Chogoris, the Emperor arrived. The Warhawk and the Father. The Emperor of Mankind came to Chogoris accompanied by Horus Lupercal and a fleet of the Lunar Wolves Legion, and when he saw what his scattered son had built on this lost world, he hailed him as a true inheritor of everything the Great Crusade was meant to be. Jaghatai submitted immediately and without apparent reservation, a response that surprised many observers, given the speed with which he had just conquered a world and the evident capability he had demonstrated in doing so. The most plausible reading of this submission is not that Jaghatai was overawed, but that he recognized in the Emperor the scale of purpose that Chogoris had been too small to contain. He had already discovered that ruling a conquered empire was considerably less interesting than the conquest itself. The Emperor offered him a galaxy. Command of the Veith Legion of Space Marines came with the relationship. Before Jaghatai's arrival, the Veith had been known as the Star Hunters, scattered across the galaxy in pioneer companies that ranged far ahead of the main Crusade fleets, operating independently without unified doctrine or tradition, each company developing its own culture in the absence of a Primarch to provide one. The reunion with their gene sire transformed the Legion physically and culturally. The rank of Jaghatai's fierce Chogorian army was inducted into the Legion, bringing with it the culture of the steppes, the calligraphy, the oral tradition, the shamanistic relationship with the wind and sky and the natural world, the specific quality of honor that the steppe tribes had developed over generations of living in a landscape that rewarded those qualities and killed those without them. In 875 M30, a full 10 years after his discovery, Jaghatai gathered all the pioneer companies on Chogoris and declared that they would be unified in a shared tradition and ritual. In what became known as the Blooding, 50,000 warriors took up knives and cut the marks of the new order into their faces. They took Chogorian names. They became, formally and collectively, something new. Neither the fractured pioneer companies of before nor simply an army in Chogorian dress, but a legion that had genuinely synthesized two traditions into something that was recognizably both and identical to neither. After the war against the Nephilim on the world of Hood, they acquired the name that would follow them through the rest of history, the White Scars, a designation derived from both the ritual marking and the ivory white livery that now blazed from their armor. The wider Imperium largely dismissed them as barbarians. This was a misreading of significant consequence, and one that Jaghatai Khan did not especially bother to correct. The White Scars were poets and calligraphers as well as warriors, a people who had produced a sophisticated oral culture on the steppes of Chogoris, and who found no contradiction between writing verse and killing enemies with extreme efficiency. What they were not was interested in performing civilization for the benefit of people they considered ignorant. Jaghatai valued honesty over protocol and action over words, and the Imperium's habit of mistaking the absence of performance for the absence of substance was something he found beneath his attention. The Great Crusade, lightning across the stars. The White Scars found their tactical doctrine in what the steppes had always taught, that speed is not simply a quality but a weapon, that an army which controls the pace of an engagement controls its outcome, and that the traditional advantages of a larger or more heavily armed force are significantly diminished against an opponent who chooses when and where every contact occurs. Jaghatai Khan's legion brought this philosophy to the stars in its purest form, and the Great Crusade provided unlimited opportunity to prove its validity. In the field, the White Scars operated in ways that made strategic logisticians miserable and enemies terrified. They did not advance toward defended positions if they could help it. They found the gaps, the flanks, the supply lines, the positions the enemy had not thought to defend because no conventional force would attack from that direction. They struck hard, dissolved back into movement, and appeared somewhere unexpected before the response to the previous strike had been fully organized. Against the variety of enemies the crusade presented, human holdouts, alien polities, the strange and terrible civilizations that the Age of Strife had produced in the Imperium's absence, this approach was devastatingly effective. Jaghatai gained a fierce reputation and significant glory during this period, including at the Ullanor Crusade against the Orc Empire of Overlord Urg, where the White Scars and Ultramarines were tasked with attacking the outer planets of the Ullanor system as a deliberate decoy, drawing the Orc fleets away from the central world and allowing Horus and the Lunar Wolves to strike the killing blow at the heart of the Empire. His closest relationships among his brother Primarchs were with Horus Lupercal, who had been the one to accompany the Emperor to Chogoris, and with whom the Khan maintained a genuine warmth, and Magnus the Red of the Thousand Suns, whose intellectual curiosity and sophisticated culture found something familiar in the White Scar's own synthesis of martial and scholarly traditions. The White Scar's relationship with their storm seers was a persistent point of friction with other factions within the Imperium. The storm seers were the shamanistic psykers of the Legion, combining the formal training of the Librarius with the animistic traditions of Chogoris tribal holy men who had ridden the steppes for generations, reading the wind and the sky for signs and guidance. The Edict of Nicaea, the council at which the Emperor formally restricted the use of psykers within the legions, presented the White Scars with a problem they resolved through the application of Chogorian linguistic precision. The edict banned librarians, and the Stormseers were not librarians. They were Stormseers. The distinction was real in the sense that the Whites genuinely understood their psykers within a different tradition from the formal librarius structure, and it was convenient in the sense that it allowed the Legion to retain capabilities that would have been significantly diminished by strict compliance. Jaghatai saw no hypocrisy in this, and would not have acknowledged the accusation had it been made to his face. The Khan's approach to the crusade itself had a quality of principled independence that frustrated some of his brother Primarchs and delighted others. He was in it, as one assessment put it, out of principle, and the recognition that the alternative was extinction, rather than out of the worshipful devotion that characterized the relationship some other Primarchs maintained with the Emperor. He saw the Great Crusade as the right work to do, because it was the right work, not because the Emperor had said so, and this distinction mattered to him in ways that were sometimes difficult to explain to those around him. The trap at Kondax and the gathering darkness. In the years immediately preceding the Horus heresy, the White Scars found themselves deep in the Kondax system, engaged in the extermination of a remnant Orc empire across a region of strategically unimportant worlds. The campaign was a hunt, and Jaghatai had willingly committed to it. What he did not know, what no one in the Veith Legion knew, isolated by the distances of the campaign and by warp storms that had begun to interfere with communication, was that Horus had already chosen his path, that the Istvan massacres had already happened, and that the entire Chondax campaign was a trap designed to keep the White Scars out of the unfolding war. The Alpha Legion had been deployed to ensure this isolation continued. They manipulated the Orc distribution across the system to keep the White Scars occupied, interfered with communication channels to prevent accurate intelligence from reaching the Khan, and when the time came for the White Scars to finally break free of Chondax, they manufactured competing contradictions designed to push the Legion toward the wrong choice. Two messages arrived. One claiming from Horus that Lemon Russ and the Space Wolves had destroyed Prospero on the Emperor's orders, and that the White Scars should punish the Wolves for this treachery. Another from Rogel Dawn, labeling Horus himself as the traitor and urging immediate return to Terra. The contradiction was a calculated attempt to paralyze the Khan or drive him into the wrong camp through the sheer weight of apparent betrayal on every side. Jaghatai Khan's response to this manufactured confusion was characteristically his own. He refused to choose based on incomplete information. He went to find answers. The White Scars broke the Alpha Legion blockade and made their way to Prospero, where the burning ruins of the Thousand Suns world waited in silence. There were no space wolves here. There were no clear answers. There were only ruins and the ghosts of a legion that Jaghatai had considered close to his own. Eventually he found what he was looking for. A projection of Magnus the Red, his brother, reaching across the ruin of Prospero's destruction to speak to him one last time. Magnus urged Jaghatai to choose, to finally commit to one side or the other, and in the exchange between them, the broken Red King and the unbroken Warhawk, Jaghatai found what he had come to find. The Khan shattered the projection with his sword. He had his answer. The White Scars were loyal. This decision was not unanimous within the Legion. The warrior lodges, organizations that had developed among the Terran-born portions of the Legion during the long pre-Chogorian period, had been infiltrated and manipulated by agents working for Horus, and a significant faction of White Scars warriors, primarily from the Terran contingent, who had never fully integrated into Chogorian culture and who found the lodge's promise of brotherhood and belonging more compelling than the Khan's independent path, had declared for the War Master. When the Khan made his loyalty clear, this internal schism required resolution. He resolved it directly. Those who had actively fought against their brothers were given the choice of execution or the Magyar Mazan. The suicide squads sent into the worst fighting with no expectation of survival, their names struck from the Legion's records, offered the chance to redeem themselves in death. Some found that redemption. Most did not survive to return from the missions they were given. The heresy, the hunt across broken stars. The White Scars spent most of the Horus heresy doing what they did best, hunting. As the only full-strength legion not committed to the defense of specific territory or the prosecution of a fixed campaign, they were the one mobile force capable of engaging the traitor advance across a broad front, striking supply lines, ambushing isolated forces, disrupting the coordination of Horus's sprawling military machine. They were outnumbered at every engagement and victorious at most of them, because the White Scars had never required numerical parity to achieve results, and the traitor forces were not structured to respond effectively to an enemy that never presented a fixed target. The recurring antagonist of this campaign was Mortarion, the Primarch of the Death Guard, who hated Jaghatai Khan in the specific way that people hate those who represent something they have chosen to destroy in themselves. Mortarion despised Psykers with a completeness that went beyond tactical preference into something closer to religious conviction. The White Scars Stormseers were therefore not merely opponents, but affronts, and the Death Guard's Lord was deployed specifically against the White Scars with the dual purpose of neutralizing their effectiveness and of making the destruction of the Khan's Legion a personal satisfaction. This rivalry reached its culmination at Catalus, where the Death Guard caught up with the White Scars as the Legion was studying a webway portal controlled by a device called the Dark Glass. The Khan wished to make a last stand there. His chief Stormseer Yesuge, one of the most gifted Psykers in any Legion, had a different assessment, that the portal could be opened to Terra, and that the Legion's duty lay at the throne world rather than in a final battle against Mortarion's forces. Jaghatai deferred to this judgment. The White Scars entered the webway, and the Death Guard were denied the kill they had been pursuing across years of warfare. On Terra, the Khan found his brothers already locked into the grim logic of the siege, holding the Imperial Palace while Horus's forces pressed their assault. Rogel Dawn, commanding the defense, was unwilling to release forces for the kind of mobile counterstrikes that the Khan's instincts demanded. The two Primarchs disagreed, though they did not break. Jaghatai understood the strategic necessity, even if he found it painfully passive. When Dawn finally gave him leave to act during the siege proper, The Khan led hundreds of jet bikes against the Death Guard positions at the gates of the Imperial Palace. The assault that would become one of the most celebrated moments of the siege, not for its strategic complexity, but for its elemental ferocity. The sons of Chogoris unleashing everything their world had made them against an enemy that had been pursuing them for years. The Siege of Terra ended as it ended. Horus died. The Emperor was broken. The legions stood down from a war that had consumed a generation. The disappearance of the Great Khan. After the heresy, Jaghatai Khan spent 70 years continuing to lead his legion through the aftermath. The campaigns of the Great Scouring that drove the traitor legions back into the Eye of Terror, and the establishment of the new Imperium that rowboat Guilliman's Codex Astartes was organizing. The White Scars reorganized into chapters along with the other legions, and the Warhawk continued to lead the chapter that bore his legion's name. Then the Drukhari came to Chogoris. The Dark Eldar raid on Jaghatai's homeworld was devastating in a way that nothing else could have been, because Chogoris was not simply territory, it was the source. The steppe tribes who provided the chapter's warriors, the culture that gave the White Scars their identity, the physical world that Jaghatai had conquered and then left behind but never entirely abandoned. All of this was targeted by a Drukhari cabal whose motivations and full identity remained disputed. The Khan pursued the raiders as they fled. He pursued them through a webway portal. Jaghatai Khan has not been seen since. The White Scars believe he is alive somewhere within the webway, still hunting, still moving at the speed that defined him, pursuing a quarry through the alien maze beneath reality with the same patient ferocity that he had brought to every hunt since the steppes of Chogoris. They believe he will return when the need is great enough. This faith is not merely consolation. It is the chapter's understanding of who the Great Khan is. A man for whom the hunt is not an activity but a state of being, for whom forward motion is the only authentic posture toward the universe. He did not stop. He kept moving. He is still moving. The White Scars hold a hatred of the Drukhari as a result that is among the most absolute of any chapter's racial enmities, the kind of hostility that does not require justification in any specific engagement, because the original justification is written into the chapter's history at the level of its founding wound. The chapter in the Long War. 10,000 years after the Horus heresy, the White Scars remain what they have always been. The Imperium's cavalry in the deepest sense of the word, the force that exists to move faster than the war it fights, to strike where the enemy is not prepared, and to be gone before the inevitable weight of a larger force can be brought to bear. Chogoris continues to be the sole recruitment world for the chapter. The steppes have not changed in any way that matters. There are still nomadic tribes, still the harsh equestrian culture that produces warriors with the instincts the White Scars require, still the wind and the mountains and the vast open distances that shape a specific quality of person. The storm seers ride out into the plains to observe the tribes at war, watching for the candidates who demonstrate not merely physical capability, but the right relationship with movement and terrain, and the calculated aggression that the chapter's doctrine demands. Those who are selected leave their tribal identities behind and take Chogorian names as new White Scars, their old loyalties replaced by a loyalty that is larger and more permanent. The chapter's organization reflects its culture at every level. The Stormseers perform the functions that other chapters assign to librarians and chaplains, both combining psychic capability with spiritual authority in the tradition of the shamans who first named Jaghatai Khan, the Great Khan of the tribes. When a Great Khan, the chapter master, is lost, the Stormseers retire to the caves of the Kumkatra mountains of Chogoris to conduct trials for the successor whose nature and severity are not disclosed. Few candidates survive. Those who emerge do not speak of what they endured. The White Scars have fought across every theater of the Imperium's endless wars. They served alongside Saint Sabbat during the liberation of the Sabbat worlds. They led the Space Marine contingent in the Damocles Gulf Crusade against the Tiao Empire, a conflict in which their speed-based doctrine proved unexpectedly well matched against an enemy whose own tactical philosophy emphasized mobility and the use of technology to equalize physical disadvantages. They have fought Tyranid hive tendrils and chaos incursions and orc wargs and every other variety of threat that the galaxy has produced against the Imperium's borders. Throughout all of this, they have maintained the quality that defines them beyond any tactical doctrine or organizational detail, the refusal to be fixed. The White Scars do not defend in the way that other chapters defend. They do not stand and absorb and hold. They meet a threat by moving around it, through it, past it, finding the angle that the threat has not considered, because the threat is thinking in terms of positions rather than in terms of momentum. This is not recklessness. The White Scars have centuries of evidence that the approach works, and the discipline required to maintain speed as a consistent tactical principle is greater than the discipline required to stand in a shield wall and endure. It is the discipline of knowing when to strike and when to disengage, of maintaining the clarity of purpose that prevents the hunt from becoming a charge into destruction. The nature of the White Scars. What the Imperium has never quite managed to understand about the White Scars is that they are not performing their culture. They are not warriors who have adopted a steppe aesthetic as a kind of exotic flavoring to conventional Space Marine combat doctrine. The culture is the doctrine, and the doctrine is the culture. And neither of these can be separated from the specific history of a people who learned on a distant planet that the fastest and most disciplined fighters could defeat the heaviest and most organized ones. The poetry matters. The calligraphy matters. The oral tradition that carries the history of the chapter across generations matters. These are not decorative elements around a core of straightforward violence. They are part of the same intellectual and spiritual formation that produces warriors who think at speed, who can process a changing battlefield and respond to it in real time, rather than reverting to a plan made before contact with the enemy. The White Scars' tactical flexibility is not natural talent. It is the product of a culture that has always valued the mind's capacity to read and respond to changing conditions, whether that capacity is being applied to a poem or a battle. This integration of martial and scholarly traditions is what has always distinguished the chapter from those who dismiss it as barbaric, and it is what produces the specific quality of White Scars' aggression: controlled, purposeful, calibrated rather than wild, directed at outcomes rather than simply unleashed. Jaghatai Khan designed a legion and a chapter that could be ferocious and disciplined simultaneously, that understood the difference between the fury that serves the hunt and the fury that defeats it, and that had the cultural framework to maintain that distinction under the worst conditions combat produces. The gene seed of the White Scars is stable, displaying few of the aberrations that afflict some chapters descended from more troubled primarchs. What the genome does carry is the wild savagery of the Chogorian steppe tribes, the thirst for war that the steppes cultivated over generations, and that Jaghatai's own formidable temperament reinforced. The chapter's teachers and storm seers work constantly to ensure that this savagery is directed rather than released without purpose, that the hunt does not become slaughter. This is not always entirely successful. There are incidents in the chapter's history, the Red Highway Massacre among the most notorious, where White Scars forces exceeded their mission parameters in ways that the chapter acknowledges without fully explaining. The wildness is real. The discipline is what makes it useful. The White Scars' successor chapters, the Rampagers, the Marauders, the Destroyers, the Stormlords, each carry some portion of Jaghatai's legacy, each expressing the core doctrine of speed and mobility in configurations shaped by their own histories and personalities. None of them have entirely replicated the synthesis that the original achieved, because that synthesis was the product of a specific primarch's specific character on a specific world, and such combinations are not easily reproduced. They are good chapters. They are not quite the white scars. The Warhawk waits. Somewhere in the webway, Jaghatai Khan is moving. The white scars believe this because it is consistent with everything they know about him, because a man who conquered a planet out of grief and loyalty and the recognition that standing still was not an option has not stopped moving, simply because the trail went underground, and the quarry is a Drukhari lord who knows the labyrinth better than any human. The great Khan moved faster than anyone expected on Chogoris. He moved faster than anyone expected during the Great Crusade. He moved faster than Mortarion could contain during the Horus Heresy, emerging from the webway onto Terra when his brothers had given up expecting him. He is, by the chapter's reckoning, still ahead of the pursuit, still hunting, still choosing his own pace and his own direction and his own moment to strike, somewhere in the alien dark beneath reality, where time moves differently and the walls of the material world are thin and the wind from Chogoris cannot follow, but perhaps the memory of it can. The Stormseers believe that the spirits of the land and air that have always guided the white scars are with him still, that the chapter's victories are won in part because of what Jaghatai's continued movement in the webway means for those spirits, that there is an unbroken thread between the steps of Chogoris and the Khan's endless hunt that neither distance nor the webway's strangeness has been able to sever. This is faith in the precise sense, the confidence in things not seen, sustained by the character of the one in whom the confidence is placed. The Warhawk will return when the need is great enough. The chapter prepares for that return by being worthy of it, by fighting in ways that the Khan would recognize and sanction, by maintaining the speed and the discipline and the fierce honor of the steps that he brought from Chogoris to the stars, and never, not for a moment, allowed to be diluted into something safer and smaller and easier for the Imperium to understand. They are the sons of the great Khan. They do not stand and wait. They hunt, and somewhere, in the dark between worlds, their father hunts with them. The culture of the Ordu. The White Scars call themselves the Ordu of Jaghatai, the Horde in the Chogorian tradition, and this self-designation carries more meaning than the Imperium's broader nomenclature. An Ordu is not simply an army. It is a people in motion, a community organized around the requirements of a specific way of living and fighting, carrying its traditions and its identity through the world without being dependent on any fixed point for sustenance. The White Scars are the Ordu in this full sense, a traveling people whose home is the movement itself, as much as the planet they recruit from, whose culture is maintained not by the walls of a fortress, but by the shared practices and stories and marks that each warrior carries as part of their identity. The facial scarring that every white scar bears is the most immediately visible expression of this. The mark taken at the blooding 10,000 years ago was the founding act of the Legion's unified identity, and the tradition of marking has continued in different forms ever since. The specific patterns of scarring within the modern chapter carry information about a warrior's history, his lineage within the chapter, his brotherhood and his achievements, in the same way that the lineage chants of a tribal warrior carry the same information through sound rather than skin. The marks are not decorative. They are a record, worn permanently, available for reading by those who know the language. The calligraphy that the White Scars practice is one of the oldest of the Chogorian noble pursuits that Jaghatai instituted at the blooding, and it remains one of the most respected within the chapter. A White Scar warrior who cannot write, who has not disciplined his hand and his attention to the precise level that the creation of meaningful marks requires, is considered incomplete in his formation regardless of his combat capability. This is not affectation. Calligraphy requires and develops a specific quality of controlled attention, the capacity to apply force at exactly the right level and direction without either holding back or exceeding the mark. And this capacity is what distinguishes a controlled White Scars strike from a brawl. The discipline is the same, The expression is different. The oral tradition is the chapter's memory. Stories of the Great Crusade, of the heresy, of the campaigns fought in the long war since, are preserved in forms that can be recited and transmitted without the medium of text. A deliberate choice by a culture that understood mobility as a fundamental value and wanted nothing about its memory dependent on a fixed location. The Stormseers are the primary custodians of this tradition, responsible for ensuring that the recitation continues accurately across generations and that the stories are understood as more than entertainment, as the actual substance of what the chapter is and why. Among the stories kept most carefully are those of the Magyar Mazan. The names are struck from the record, that is the point, that is the cost. But the tradition itself is preserved. The understanding that betrayal within the chapter is met not with simple execution, but with the offer of redemption through demonstrated sacrifice. This is not mercy in a conventional sense. It is the recognition that the worst thing that can happen to a warrior of the White Scars is to have his name removed from the oral record, to be unmemorialized, and that the offer of the Magyar Mazan is therefore simultaneously the harshest possible judgment and the only remaining path back to inclusion in the tradition. Those who take the path and survive it long enough to achieve something noteworthy face a further complexity. The stories of what they did survive, even when the names that performed those deeds do not. The chapter's relationship with horses is sometimes misunderstood as mere symbolism. On Chogoris, the horse is not a symbol. It is a partner, a tool, and a measure of a warrior's worth, in a culture that for centuries evaluated men and women by their relationship with the animals that made the steppes survivable. The mounted warfare that defined the tribes of the Empty Quarter was not cavalry, in the way that settled armies used cavalry, as a supplement to infantry, a shock force deployed at a specific moment in a fixed engagement. It was the whole art of war, and the steppe warriors' mastery of their horse was the foundation of everything else they could do. The White Scars no longer ride horses in combat, having replaced them with the jet bikes and attack bikes that carry the same philosophy into the technological context of the 41st millennium. But the understanding of what the horse represented, the partnership between warrior and vehicle, the specific discipline of controlling speed and direction simultaneously while maintaining awareness of the surrounding battlefield, persists in how they ride and fight. A White Scars warrior on a jet bike is not simply a fast-moving infantry unit. They are the direct inheritor of a tradition that is thousands of years old, practicing a discipline that their culture considers the highest expression of the martial art, applying the specific lessons of the Chogorian steppes to a battlefield that their distant ancestors could not have imagined. The connection is genuine, and the chapter maintains it deliberately, because losing it would mean losing something essential about who they are. Mortarion and the eternal rivalry. Among all the relationships the White Scars have maintained across their history, with brother chapters, with the institutions of the Imperium, with specific enemies, the one with the Death Guard and their daemon Primarch Mortarion carries a particular weight. It is the oldest active enmity the chapter maintains against a specific legion, predating even the hatred of the Drukhari that came with the Khan's disappearance, and it has a specific ideological dimension that distinguishes it from simply two forces that found themselves on opposite sides of a long war. Mortarion hated Psykers. He hated them with a conviction that went to the foundations of who he was, rooted in the specific horrors of the world where he had been raised, where sorcery had been the instrument of oppression rather than a tool that could be disciplined and directed. His hatred was not irrational given what had produced it, but it was absolute in a way that could not acknowledge exceptions or nuance. And the White Scars Stormseers were therefore not merely opponents, but an affront to a principle he considered sacred. Every time the White Scars used their Psykers, every time a Stormseer read the wind of the warp to guide an assault or reinforced a warrior's fury with the power of the steppe spirits, Mortarion felt it as a personal insult. The conflicts between the two legions during the heresy were therefore not purely tactical. They were arguments, conducted in the language of violence, about whether Mortarion's conviction was correct. The White Scar's consistent effectiveness, their ability to use the Storm Seers not as a separate cast of supporting casters, but as fully integrated elements of their combat doctrine, combining psychic capacity with the same speed and aggression that defined every other aspect of their fighting, was the evidence for the argument that Mortarion's position was wrong. The Death Guard could not catch them. The Stormseer's warnings could not be silenced. The White Scars went through the dark glass portal to Terra, and Mortarion was denied. At the Siege of Terra, the two Primarchs faced each other directly, and the duel they fought was the culmination of a rivalry that the Horus Heresy had made explicit, and the subsequent 10,000 years of the Long War have sustained in a different form. Mortarion is a Daemon Primarch now, locked in his futted garden world within the Eye of Terror, while the White Scars continue to fight in the material universe at the Imperium's edges and Heartlands both. But the Death Guard's hatred of the Speed and Storm warriors of Chogoris has not diminished with the millennia, and when the forces of the Death Guard encounter a White Scars force on the battlefield, both sides bring to the engagement the full weight of everything their history means. The Storm and the Steppe. There is a Chogorian tradition that the Stormseers preserve, older than the Great Crusade and older than the White Scars themselves, that holds the wind to be the truest warrior. The wind does not announce itself before it arrives. It does not hold a fixed position. It does not argue about the direction it chooses or justify its force to those in its path. It comes, it does what it does, and it is gone, and the world is changed by its passage. The Stormseers teach that the ideal White Scars warrior aspires to be something like the wind, present where the enemy has not prepared, gone before the response can be organized, having changed the situation in ways that will not immediately be understood. This ideal is not fully achievable. Warriors are not wind, and the warriors of the White Scars are mortal men enhanced into something extraordinary, but not supernatural, who bleed and die in the same fundamental sense as every other Space Marine. The ideal is aspirational, a direction of travel rather than a destination. But the aspiration shapes the practice, and the practice produces the results that the wider Imperium has valued and feared in equal measure for 10,000 years. Jaghatai Khan built the White Scars on the understanding that the most powerful force in any culture is the one that shapes what its members aspire to be. He did not need to tell his warriors to be fast. He gave them a culture in which speed was the highest expression of the martial virtue, in which the wind was the metaphor for the perfect warrior, in which the greatest stories were stories of pursuit and strike and movement rather than of standing firm. The aspiration did the work. The warriors did the rest. In the 41st millennium, that culture persists essentially unchanged in its fundamental character, adapted to the technologies and the specific threats of a galaxy that is more hostile than the one in which it was forged. The White Scars paint the lightning across their armor for the same reason their ancestors cut the marks into their faces at the blooding, to announce what they are, to make visible the tradition that moves with them through a universe that does not stand still for anyone. The Warhawk is gone into the webway and has not returned. The storm that he called up on the steppes of Chogoris 10,000 years ago continues without him, carried by the sons he made, the gene seed he left in them, the culture he built and they have maintained. It is the most complete expression of what he always valued, a thing that does not require his presence to continue, that has become self-sustaining, that moves on its own momentum toward the horizon. That is what the White Scars are. That is what they will be, in whatever form the future requires, until the Warhawk returns to lead them again. The storm does not stop, the brothers and the distances. Among the 20 Primarchs, Jaghatai Khan occupied a specific position defined more by what he chose not to be than by what he chose to be. He was not a conquering glory seeker in the manner of some of his brothers. He was not a politician or a schemer. He was not a true believer in the imperial truth in the way that some of the more zealous Primarchs were, nor a rebel against it in the way that the traitors became. He was, in a sense, that the other Primarchs found difficult to categorize, genuinely indifferent to the competition of status and recognition that occupied so much of the councils and interactions of the legions. This indifference was sometimes mistaken for simplicity. It was the opposite of simplicity. The Khan had no interest in being understood by people he found shallow, which meant that his actual complexity, the synthesis of warrior and poet, the fierce honor that the steppe tradition had built into him, the principled independence that made him loyal to the Emperor's purpose rather than to the Emperor's person, was invisible to most who encountered him. He did not perform. He did not explain himself. He rode out, he fought, and he came back with results. And the Imperium could draw whatever conclusions about him it chose. His friendship with Horus Lupercal was real, and its ending was genuinely painful, in the way that the loss of something genuine is always more painful than the loss of something that was performance. The two had been close since the beginning. Horus had been present at Chogoris, had seen Jaghatai in his full context, rather than through the filter of the Imperium's prejudices, had valued him for what he actually was. When Horus fell, what the Khan lost was not merely an ally, but one of the small number of people in the galaxy who had seen him clearly. The decision to remain loyal despite this was not simple or painless. It was the right decision, which is not the same thing. Magnus the Red represented a different kind of kinship, the intellectual affinity between two cultures that had both found a way to be simultaneously martial and sophisticated, both of which combined the study of power with the practice of it in ways that the more narrowly focused legions could not. The destruction of Prospero, the corruption of Magnus, the transformation of the Thousand Suns into the shattered remnant that would become one of Chaos's most twisted instruments, all of this hit the Khan in a specific register. The loss not of an enemy, but of an argument that had always been worth having. He went to Prospero to find answers and found only ruins, and the shade of Magnus that appeared to him was already too far gone to give him what he had come for. What he learned at Prospero was sufficient. He shattered the shade and chose his side. The choice did not make him happy. It made him right, which in Jaghatai Khan's moral framework was the more important of the two. The relationship with Rogal Dorn during the Siege of Terra is one of the more instructive case studies in the variety of loyalist temperaments. Dorn and Khan agreed on almost nothing regarding how to conduct the defense. Dorn's instinct was to hold, to build, to force the enemy to come to him, and to make the approach as costly as possible. The Khan's instinct was to move, to harry, to deny the enemy the settled engagement in which their superior numbers would be decisive. Both approaches were right from their own premises, and neither Primarch was capable of fully operating within the other's framework without losing something essential. They were not enemies, but they were not comfortable with each other either, and the friction between their visions of how the siege should be fought was a small additional stress upon the greatest crisis the Imperium had ever faced. That the siege was eventually won is a testament to both of their stubbornness, Dorn holding the walls, the Khan eventually unleashed against Mortarian's death guard, more than to any perfect coordination between them. What the Khans know. Every great Khan of the White Scars has understood something about the chapter that is not written in the Codex Astartes and cannot be derived from any document the Imperium has produced about the proper organization and deployment of Space Marine forces. It is the understanding that the chapter's doctrine is not a set of tactical instructions, but a way of being, and that it can only be maintained by a culture that genuinely believes in it, rather than by warriors following a prescribed method. The White Scars cannot fight the way they fight by instruction alone. The speed requires commitment, the commitment requires trust, and the trust requires that every warrior in the formation understands at a fundamental level why doctrine works and what it is asking of them. This understanding is what the Stormseers cultivate, what the oral tradition preserves, what the calligraphy disciplines, what the facial marking announces. It is the shared worldview that makes a group of individuals into the Ordo of Jaghatai. This is why the chapter recruits only from Chogoris, a decision that is sometimes questioned by Imperial strategists who note the geographical constraint it places on recruitment numbers. The answer to this concern is the same answer the White Scars have always given to misunderstandings of their nature. The number matters less than the quality, and the quality cannot be produced anywhere else. The steppes of Chogoris produce a specific kind of person, shaped by the specific demands of a specific landscape and culture, and only that person can become the specific kind of warrior the White Scars need. Recruiting elsewhere would produce more warriors. It would produce fewer White Scars. The Great Khans have held this position through 10,000 years of pressure to conform to broader imperial standards of organization and recruitment, to become more like the other chapters that the Codex envisions, and less like the nomadic horde of the empty quarter that their culture descends from. They have refused this pressure with the same principled independence that Jaghatai Khan brought to the imperial truth and the Edict of Nicaea and Rogal Dorn's vision of how the siege should be fought. They know what they are. They know why it works. They are not interested in becoming something safer and more comprehensible and less effective for the benefit of people who have not had to defend the Imperium in the way the White Scars have had to defend it. The wind does not stop blowing because a settled man finds it inconvenient. The storm does not moderate itself in deference to those who prefer calm. The White Scars are the children of the steppe and the inheritors of a Primarch who conquered an empire because he refused to be limited by what the existing arrangements allowed. They will not be limited now. They ride, they strike, they are gone before the response has formed. They leave the enemy broken and the Imperium standing, and then they ride again. This has always been enough. It always will be. The Burkuts of Chogoris hunt by rising above the plain until the world below becomes a pattern rather than a landscape, and then folding their wings and dropping at speeds that nothing on the ground can track until the moment of impact. They do not announce their arrival. They do not give their prey the courtesy of preparation. They drop, they strike, and they rise again. Jaghatai Khan called his legion the Burkuts of the plains of Chogoris. It was the most precise description he ever offered of what he wanted them to be. The White Scars have spent 10,000 years proving him right.